One of the major issues, of course, that we faced in 1959 was the issue of lands and land selection.
Buried in the list of federal lands that Alaska could select was some flat and wind-swept Arctic tundra. And buried beneath that tundra was something very interesting.
In geological terms, it was the Barrow Canning River Arch, which is a giant rollover of the sedimentary rocks coming out of the foothills area of the North Slope. This provided about 100-mile-long structural fold, which is what oil finders are looking for when they're after elephant-sized fields.
But there were serious financial and political risks to selecting the barren North Slope lands, where Tom Marshall thought there might be enormous oil deposits.
The trouble with Alaskan politicians is they looked upon land as real estate, not as the source of resource development.
Alaskans have always been, still are, a little, not as bad as they were then, but land crazy. I mean, those are the lust for land. I'll admit myself, I like to own a chunk of land in Alaska.
And most Alaskans wanted the state to select lands near where they live, not on the far-off tundra, and to make the land available to them. Many criticized Egan for going slowly.
If the state had selected huge amounts of land, then there would have been substantial reductions in the federal funds available. And of course, the budget was the big sweat. We just had nickels and dimes in those days, I mean, a few $1 million to make the government run.
There was quite a cadre of people who thought of the selection as Marshall's folly. In particular, all the landmen of the major companies, and where they were not interested, not one of them, in the Prudhoe Bay area.
We had a very good Commissioner of Natural Resources, Phil Holdsworth. You know, we have statues of different people. There should be one for Phil Holdsworth as well.
As Territorial Commissioner of Mines, Holdsworth had known Bill Egan for years and was a consultant on natural resources for the Constitutional Convention.
He and I were working on the background for the natural resources provisions of the Constitution. And he told me, he said, George, we're very fortunate. If this convention were being held 5 years from now, we wouldn't have to be here. Standard Oil Company would tell us what this provision should be. And he was right.
A lot of credit should go to Phil Holdsworth, Roscoe Bell, the director of lands at the time, because they backed up Marshall in his hunch. And more importantly, they convinced Governor Egan, who was very reluctant, very suspicious of the oil industry, to go along with those recommendations.
So Egan selected the North Slope lands, and a few oil companies took a chance on leases to drill exploratory wells.
I believe that it was one of the most remarkably courageous oil exploration programs I have ever heard about in my whole life. Drilling on the Arctic slope of Alaska with no roads, very poor air transportation, thousands of miles from supplies.
The early history of test drilling on the slope was actually very disappointing. 7, 8 dry holes drilled by the companies, and they were really about to leave the North Slope.
Alaskans elected a new governor in 1966, and he hadn't given up.
And so in 68, I took the oil companies up there. ARC was the one that took up. Their top geologist told me why they weren't going to drill. And I just said, Harry, drill or I will. And he says, you will. I says, you're damn right. It's our land and our oil.
And literally, the story is that the rig was being cat trained to the Arctic Ocean, where it was going to be barged out. And because it was going past Prudhoe Bay, they decided, well, let's drill this prospect, one last hole, one last try by Arco and Humboldt. And if it's a dry hole, that's it. We're pulling out of here. And they drilled the well and they hit it. And that's how Prudhoe Bay was discovered.
But Alaskans didn't know if such remote deposits would be commercially viable, not until a new round of lease sales took place in September 1969 in Anchorage. Alaska's Natural Resources Department tried to increase the expectations and thereby the bids.
We were trying to embellish, if you will, have people get the impression that we really knew everything that was going on, where we really didn't know all the things. The only way we could only get so much raw data and information.
In the weeks before the lease sale, Tom Kelly's geologists kept a high public profile, meeting many times to supposedly map out the oil reserves.
You need a prop if you're going to convince people that, you're for real. Well, what's better than a map tube from a geological standpoint? You've got maps in there, obviously, at least they think you do.
It paid off on the day of the lease sale.
$68.75. It was a real circus, and the high rollers were all there.
There were a lot of Texas hats in the room that people had flown in on jet planes.
Well, we were overwhelmed with the news media from every radio station, TV, and everything else from all over the country.
Atlantic Richfield Company. Total amount of bid, $3,546,1,385.27 per acre.
But we put out at the Times about 5 editions that day as the bids mounted and the money rolled in. And we were down at $900 million. The whole town was agog with this.
It showed Alaskans that we were really in a new league. This was a new era. We didn't know really what it meant, but that was the signal.